Now. So my name is Jennifer Pruitt. I'm an associate professor of Islamic art history here at the UW. I am also chair of the lectures committee. And so it's in that capacity that I'm introducing this tremendous new lecture series. So I'm really delighted to welcome you to our first annual Gombar Duychak lecture in early modern print culture. Now it's unfortunate that the first one is online, but we look forward to many years of gathering together. And as we've noted, sometimes these online formats have the benefit of having people from Europe and having a broader audience. So welcome today. So I really want to thank Linda Duychak, who is here in our audience today in her beautiful red living room, for this really generous support that makes the future for early modern art history so very bright in the department. And I really look forward to a time that we can celebrate the addition of this lecture series and our new scholar in early modern art, early modern European art, Jennifer Nelson, to the department. Relatively new to the department. So Linda and her late husband, Tom Gombar, were stalwart members of the art history community at UW-Madison. They met in our hallowed halls when they were both studying Northern Renaissance art with Professor Jane Hutchison. After completing their master's degrees and preliminary exams, they each continued to serve the field and our broader community by continuing on in their work here. Linda was the long-serving art reference and instruction librarian of the Kohler Art Library. And I can say that personally, I had the distinct privilege of working with Linda late in her career here when she really introduced me to the Kohler and came to my classes to introduce students to our library, our rich library resources, which was always such a delight. And I miss seeing you, Linda. Tom Gombar, who sadly passed in 2015, was a Fulbright scholar and long-serving curator of the Visual Resources collection in the department. He was instrumental in moving our department into the digital age, serving as a lead in securing an instructional technology grant, which really allowed us to move our rich visual collection online. So he's really a pioneer in this regard. I'm really happy to be honoring both of them with this award. As I asked people to recall Tom, it was noted how kind but also humorous he was. So I'm delighted to have this lecture in his honor. Linda tells me that she and Tom spent many days conducting research at the Newberry. So I'm particularly happy that we can honor their personal history with today's speaker who comes to us from that esteemed collection. And now I'm going to hand off the torch to Jennifer Nelson, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Jennifer Pruitt, my great colleague. Hi, Jennifer Nelson here, relatively new assistant professor of early modern art at UW-Madison. And I want to second Professor Pruitt's thanks for the generosity of Linda Duychak in endowing this lecture series, which is just such a wonderful resource for our community, and today for far beyond just Madison itself. So we are really in for a treat tonight to kick the series off. Don't give me that look, Suzanne. Suzanne Karr Schmidt is the George Amos Poole III Curator of Rare Books and Manuscripts at the Newberry Library. She is also the preeminent scholar of the materiality and use of prints. So not only the techniques and practices involved in their making, but also, and perhaps more intriguingly in my view, the techniques and practices involved in their viewing and use. Her monograph on interactive and sculptural printmaking in the Renaissance was published in late 2017. But for years before that, as Suzanne was changing our field by working on path-breaking exhibitions like Susan Dackerman's Prints in the Practice of Knowledge, and Suzanne's own Altered and Adorned Renaissance Prints in Daily Life, which was at the Art Institute of Chicago, for years people were downloading her magisterial dissertation. And I would say it is the single most influential dissertation written in the history of prints in the last 20 years. It's possibly the most cited dissertation in early modern Northern studies in that time. The book version is, of course, even more exciting, incredibly richly and crisply illustrated, playfully illustrated. You can even make objects out of her book. Highly recommended. Nor is that book her only recent publication of note. Her 2016 co-edited volume with Ed Wook on early modern prints and translation also brought together a number of important and provocative essays on the materiality and spatiality of prints, as well as their intermediality. What I admire about Suzanne, just about as much as I admire her scholarship, is how much she has given of herself to be a mentor to less experienced scholars, sort of to open the Newberry Library to a wide audience, and you know, taking care of people who tend to feel uncomfortable in the often elitist environment of museums and rare books. So I know I'm not the only person in the audience here today who has benefited from Suzanne's incredible intellectual generosity and her encyclopedic recall of the surely tens of thousands of books and works on paper she's ever handled or seen. So I'm not sure what I do without you, Suzanne, and I can't even imagine the field of early modern prints existing without you today. Last year, despite the pandemic, Suzanne co-curated the brilliant show Renaissance Invention, Stradatis' Nova Reperta with Leah Markey at the Newberry. And we have something to look forward to there as well. Her much anticipated show on pop-up books from the Renaissance to today was just recently given the green light, I think, for winter 2023. So for now, tonight, we are lucky to be learning about her really fresh new research on flap prints that intersect with environmental alteration in the 17th century. So I know we're all on Zoom, and please remember to keep yourselves muted during the talk. Some of you have not done that, so please mute yourself now. Double check to make sure you're muted. But if you're deaf with the reaction button at the bottom, or if you have your video on, please join me in welcoming Suzanne Karr Schmidt to her virtual talk with us tonight. Suzanne.
Wow, thank you for that introduction, Jennifer. And thank you, Jennifer Pruitt, for organizing this. But most importantly, I wanted to say it is an honor to present the inaugural Gombar Duychak lecture on early modern print culture. It's a wonderful institution for this, and I'm very happy that we have such an enthusiastic fan of the Newberry who had the idea. So tonight, I will be taking a very broad approach to pre-modern print culture through the microhistory of a widely dispersed interactive broadside that documents the total devastation of a Swiss mining town known as Plurs or Pioru. Done. My discussion will be through the lens of a variety of types of ephemeral printing, many including liftable flaps. There will also be intaglio book illustrations and broadsides, woodcuts and letterpress newspapers, and pamphlets. This lecture would not be possible without new technologies, whether the early modern print engineering techniques that I studied from the 15th through the 17th century, or the many digitized early sources that I was able to access during the pandemic. And it is in part because of the pandemic that I chose the topic of interactive disaster, and even was able to purchase 2 related books for the Newberry collection. When we could still travel internationally, I took many of the pictures you'll see tonight, but others were provided more recently by the Herzog August Bibliothek in Movable and the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek in Munich. To begin with, here is an extremely short introduction to 17th century interactive prints. While there were numerous prints and book illustrations with rotating dials and quite a few Memento Mori images with flaps, relatively few books or broadsides produced by 1618 included flap landscapes or cityscapes. The one notable exception was a 1612 publication geared to armchair pilgrims about the sacred mountain of Laverna, where St. Francis of Assisi was said to have received his stigmata. Given its scale, This luxurious text aimed for an elite market, and there is unfortunately no proof that any of the Plurs broadsheet printers saw this book. It was popular enough for at least 2 editions, a curious 60 years apart. I had received approval to purchase the 1672 edition for the Newberry just before the pandemic, and it was a minor miracle that we were eventually able to have it sent from Italy some 5 months later. Here's a look inside the later edition, which reverses the order of the text and etchings, here permitting the viewer to approach the altar by folding down the rood screen. Both editions boast pages the size and style of broadsheets, and 5 of them allow the viewer to shift the terrain to retrace Francis's steps under cliffs and inside caverns, encouraging the readers to meditate on the saint's faith. As Bronwyn Wilson discusses in an upcoming publication, these lithic layers could effectively turn back time from the 17th to the 13th century and retrace Francis's steps. Letters tied to the text opposite led the careful reader to uncover the flaps and lift them reverently. In contrast to the relatively well-preserved flaps inside these books, the interactive views of Plurs were not treated quite so kindly. So, how did the broadsides of Plurs find their public? In the early modern era, news traveled fast, fake news traveled faster, and everyone desperately wanted to hear about the latest deadly disaster. Book and print collectors relived these incidents safely in their own homes through interactive mapping of an unforgiving and unpredictable landscape that could change in the blink of an eye. This group of prints with liftable flaps showing the rockslide that destroyed the mining town of Plurs or Piero, then part of Switzerland, on September 4th, 1618, offered several distinct advantages over painting and other prints of the disaster. First was their speed. Quick to produce and illustrated with hastily sketched etchings, they alternated swiftly between the landscape's normal state of being and its annihilation, more so than any static image. Reenacting the cataclysm itself, the flaps in the viewer's hands could instantly replicate the shock of the mountain's unexpected crash. Second was the physical interaction with the sheet. It required touching as well as looking and reading, creating a physical and visual rhyme with the actual event. This materiality and physical closeness first made the viewer complicit, reinforcing the insinuations of biblical verses that permeated the printed record, and then made the viewer powerful. For who but a god could swoop in from above and with the touch of their fingers undo the devastation of an entire town? Who but a god could bring the hammer of their wrath crashing down when they lowered the flap once again? Equal parts elaborately detailed spectacle and didactic morality play, these movable landscapes encapsulated the complacency and fear of the victims and encouraged this curiosity and devotional growth of the viewers. A wide variety of print media had become available throughout Europe by the early 17th century, with formats such as broadsides or broadsheets, pamphlets, and eventually newspapers. These amplified the enterprising printers' ability to alert their increasingly literate audiences of the latest battle, comet, flood, or misbirth, and the meaning of each disaster. These single-sided printed sheets and slim folded pamphlets crossed international and confessional borders, were copied, translated, and sold to any available buyer. Life and death situations were sought-after topics, and along with printed indulgences, practical annual calendars and songs, notices of current disasters are among the most popular. As fleeting as the events themselves, numerous ephemeral publications about Plurs have nonetheless survived. The interactive Plurs broadsheets survived into the modern era in the relatively high numbers of some 5 editions and 16 impressions, including the initial 1618 Zurich edition by Johann Hardmeyer, shown here with his related pamphlet to scale. The sum total might represent cumulative printings in the low thousands. There were at least 3 more illustrated broadsides without flaps, and some 20 pamphlets on this topic by 1619. In contrast to the broadsides, the pamphlets often went unillustrated or reused standard woodblocks that were purely ornamental or implicitly moralizing, as in the stock images of the Last Judgment or death on the title pages of several Plurs pamphlets. By adding the before and after flap of the devastated landscape on top of a view of its previously undisturbed state, the experience of the disaster was elevated to the level of personal spectacle. Even before, the flap maps precisely to a dotted line, a novel and innocuously seeming footprint of impending doom. From the many related vernacular publications purporting to have appeared from September to December of 1618, and the specificity of details they included, readers of German, French, Italian, English, and Dutch, as far as London and Prague, wanted to know more about Plurs. With its location near the Italian border and strong Germanic and Swiss roots, the site was as international a crossroad as its trade in carved soapstone cookware from locally mined stone was profitable. The pamphlet and broadsheets readers' main goal was to understand the scale of the loss of lives, income, and prestige of the district. They could also revel in their comparative good fortune or consider their own moral shortcomings. With an interactive broadsheet to relive the incident in detail, all such catharsis could become routine. Now, let's look at the iconography of the flat prints. Before the disaster on September 4th of 1618, the fantastically wealthy Swiss district of Plurs in the canton of Graubünden, also known as Grisons, was a prosperous mining site, with tradesmen well known as far as the annual Frankfurt Fair, and estimated to be worth many thousands of gold coins annually, or even more in lost goods, with quotes as high as 3 million gold coins in some pamphlets. As you can see here, it was full of houses, Italianate palaces, and ornamented churches, with an estimated population of 1,500 people, give or take the visitors in its 2 inns. The town's seemingly sheltered placement under the very mountains its inhabitants mined led in part to its destruction. Correspondingly, its location along the main Mera River permitted its profitable soapstone trade, as well as its 2 mills. But it also meant that the depression from the rockslide soon filled with water to form a lake that further obliterated the traces of the town. An unlocated close Italian copy of Hardmeyer's etching added a motto and a banderole to this area of the flap: Fortuna est generis communis, or fortune is of all kinds, suggesting that fortune's long-standing enhancement of the town's riches had made it lose its way. The new lake also anonymized the former location of Plurs, and broadsides and pamphlets noted that anyone who had not seen the town would have been convinced that nothing had ever stood there, reinforcing the biblical nature of the town's instantaneous destruction in the blink of an eye. So, what actually happened here? Well, the incident was viewed as an act of God at the time. Modern studies attribute the cataclysm to human error, with overmining of the mountains and a rainy season relating to the softening of the talc-based soapstone and under-supported channels, and to its eventual collapse. Creaking sounds were supposedly heard from the hills the nights before, as well as an unearthly stench of literal fire and brimstone, which had previously only rained on Sodom and Gomorrah. The town's bee population is said to have flown away en masse, only to be struck dead by the vapors mid-air. One report suggests the town's chancellor, Giovanni Andrea Vertima, tried to sound a warning to evacuate, but was completely ignored. Perhaps this deadly oversight was another reason for the viewer to keep the fate of Plurs ever in hand and mind. When Plurs was eclipsed by its rockslide, at least 3 illustrated German broadsides soon showed the remains of the mountain, the toppling churches, and the keening crowd from neighboring villages. On the left is one published in 1618 Strasbourg by Marx van der Heyden, which was perhaps the first to address the disaster outside of Switzerland, and bears a simple woodcut focused on the downward trajectory of the church tower. Its spire is already completely dissected, its midsection hanging at a diagonal. A Klaglied, or musical lament, is printed below the image, its 15 verses based on the horrors of the incident, and it was meant to be performed to the tune of the lugubrious sounding "I wish the world a good night." Ich wünsche der Welt eine gute Nacht. Indeed, the rockslide occurred at twilight, and nearly all of the town's inhabitants did not wake up. Only one 1618 pamphlet, however, would commission a comparable illustration to Hardmeyer's interactive broadside, or in fact 2, a dual language publication in Italian and German with a joint title page and legends in both languages on the prints. Augsburg artist Wilhelm Peter Zimmermann's rough title page etching for printer's widow Sarah Mong deposits an enormous and rugged rock pile onto the frontispiece with a visceral thump, leaving a gap in the mountain range behind. His fold-out view of the town in its previous life is less detailed than Hardmeyer's, but more lively, with foreground men on horseback suggesting commercial bustle and a tiered sense of topography, all the while indicating the extent of the future damage with its ominous line encircling Plurs. While these images already suggested the violence of impact, a flurry of the imprints with flaps offering the even more hands-on and captivating means of describing the disaster would soon follow. These pictures, in which the landscape itself would literally move under the hands of the viewer, like the earth shifting beneath the feet of Plurs residents. With all the other available visual and literary tropes, what separated the flap disasters from other single sheet broadsides trading atrocities and the wrath of the Almighty? Let's take a look. In 1619, Strasbourg and Nuremberg publishers Jakob van der Heyden and Johann Philipp Walch simultaneously produced flat broadsheets of the sudden destruction of Plurs. They were copying the slightly larger, savvy production the previous year of printmaker Johann Hardmeyer, who lived in Zurich only 150 miles from the disaster. He would later publish devotional pamphlets and other things, but seemingly only produced one flat print. Discontented with simple side-by-side or before and after views of the dramatic piles of rubble with distraught onlookers already published in Germany, Hardmeyer's broadside instead boasted an etching of the landscape with very little staffage on the outskirts to reinforce its emotional impact. Instead, he included the liftable flap that insisted the viewer participate in the destruction. Tucking the flap in under a separate letterpress title slip, he engineered a cut and paste option that would have allowed speedier and simultaneous printing on different presses that his copyists also adopted. Hardmeyer's lofty bird's eye view of the landscape around Plurs is a bit deceptive, however, as is the orientation of the compass rose under the flap, which places the viewer at due north, though the view in fact faced the opposite direction. Such tactile additions as the flap helped viewers literally grasp with their fingers the extent and with the compass, the orientation of the wreckage as they peruse the letterpress descriptions of these newsworthy events below. The use of etchings rather than laborious engraving also sped up the process. Learning from this success, van der Heyden later published an interactive sheet of the fiery 1631 siege of Magdeburg by imperial troops. Balk and van der Heyden's prints were known and described in the 19th century by the print dealer Wilhelm Eduard Drugelen, whose massive 1863 sale catalog of historical broadsides still forms a checklist for subject research today. Noting their unusual format, he listed several 17th century prints as clapbilder, you see on the left, or flap images, including 2 by Walch and van der Heyden of Plurs and 2 van der Heyden prints of Magdeburg, which we will see later. Although the Drugelen impression of the van der Heyden print had a flap and was thought to have been purchased by the British Museum, it has not been located since. The exacting detail of the entry matches the title, the number of columns below the image, and even specifies that it was an etching. I think it's a match with the object on the right, which I first saw back in 2004 in Halle an der Saale. At the top left, there's a corrosion showing that it was probably an etching from an iron plate. That's a material that is generally not adopted for burin engraving. Although missing its flap, our abrasion to the sheet shows that the one in Halle an der Saale originally had one, likely secured under the pasted on title in the same manner as the Hardmeyer. Never published or illustrated in literature, this impression appears to be the only one known of the missing van der Heyden print. So what did the flap look like? It probably looked like the static image on the right. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but this whole area is basically copying the Hardmeyer, and it includes the compass in the middle that shows up on the Walch prints as well. This, I'm not going to talk about it very much, but this van der Heyden print over here moves the before scene up to just a little box in the corner and doesn't have any flaps. So What should a first-time viewer learn from the interactive images by Hardmeyer, Volk, and van der Heyden? Already expecting the worst from the title, or having heard the news in other ways, they might not have read the fine print before realizing the dual nature of the image. But if they dutifully read through the text and started trying to match the numbers with the buildings, they would soon realize to their horror that 90% of them had been eclipsed by the rockfall and subsequent formation of the lake. To highlight the alteration in the landscape, the midsection of Hardmeyer's main text contrasts the prior landscape of Plurs with a sudden intrusion of the sea, while indicating the role of the overlying etching to just demonstrate this change. You can see some of this text on the right. Having begun with the figure as the above copperplate clearly shows, that mountain which has fallen with so much force that no stone remains standing on another, then, when the flap is lowered, instead of the district, one sees instead a sea of a half Italian miles long, as the etching likewise indicates. So, Johann Philipp Volk printed two versions copying Hardmeyer, and the second has an extended text, which you can see on the right. In fact, it further explains the purpose of the view, as well as the fact that the flap and the base were separate prints. Volk says, so that the favorable reader who would like to so much the better understand this account about the district of Plurs, there are two sketches in copper added that show how it was built before and after its downfall. In the first sketch of the district, still in its bloom, are the churches, palaces, and notable houses indicated with numbers as follows. So, with all these direct cues to the reader, what happens when the flaps are lacking? While surviving impressions of only a handful per edition, perhaps 50% survive without their flaps. The very recently acquired Newberry example of Volk's second edition that helped inspire this project was not even recognized as missing a flap when it was initially offered to the library. It originally had one, as a printed remnant at the upper left of the calamitous circumference shows. Although the left edge is properly aligned with the dotted diagonal presaging the disaster, it seems to have been attached rather low down, and it would have slightly overlapped the lower margin. As a result, the rockslide would have flowed further down the landscape than it did in actuality, as in an impression in the Augsburg Staats- and Staatsbibliothek. As the midsection of the flap is wider than the bottom, it might have given the impression that the neighboring towns had also been submerged. From a usability standpoint, it would also have made the interactive nature of the broadsheet immediately more legible. The flap would have been edging into the blank margin under the engraving, though not quite so far that it would have overtaken any of the text below. An early owner may have tried to keep the Newberry impressions flap from sliding further downward or from going missing by applying red wax on the opposite side of the remaining fragment, a bright dot itself bearing some residue of paper from the erstwhile appendage. But if the left side remained tightly glued down, was the flap at some point intentionally or even angrily ripped away? We may never know the truth, but the broadsides made many claims of their own. After Hardmeyer's highly local report of the disaster, a variety of independent publications started up throughout the rest of 1618 with much varying accuracy. As I mentioned before, some 20 pamphlets had appeared by 1619. Nearly all of them included the term "Wahrhafte Bildung," truthful illustration, in the title or title page, an opening that strongly implied that they would contain accurate information. Yet the accounts differ on important details: time of the incident, at twilight or early in the morning, the number of inhabitants lost between the likely 1500 and most improbable 3600, and the number of Italianate gardens destroyed. This terminology of quote unquote truthfulness is a continuation of the imago contrafacta concept discussed initially by Peter Partial that emerged with early printing, a discourse in which broadsheets and other writings automatically attained a certain authority through appearing in print. The additional attempt to create a sense of immediacy through words like "of the current year" or "today" suggests publication between September and December 1618, but none of the pamphlets or broadsides are specific enough to allow for a more precise order. One of the earliest publications about the disaster, Hartman's interactive broadside was also the first to furnish a list of 93 locations on the map of Plurs and its closer neighbors, Silano and Rangalio. Only 15 of these sites escaped obliteration, including a group of wine cellars to the left and a few churches and the still standing summer palace to the right, owned by the powerful and Protestant Vertema family. None of the buildings that survived were among the hills making up Plurs proper. The rest of Hardmeyer's text sets the stage for the disaster, and by giving narrative accounts of the 6 survivors, underlines the gravity of the numbers lost. 2 men were away underground in a wine cellar when the mountain collapsed, while a young man who was picking peaches was reportedly blown out of his shoes by the blast. Others were not so lucky. One mother reportedly lost her legs while attempting unsuccessfully to save her child. An unnamed elderly lady and 2 10-year-old girls were found roaming the mountains the next day, though they received less notice in the news articles. In some printed accounts, this lady describes the onslaught as enveloping the landscape in the blink of an eye. This term was likely first used in the Hardmeyer pamphlet and frequently repeated on the title pages of the disaster publications as well. While a topographical key to the vanished sites of Plurs was never appended to the early pamphlets, it reappears starting from the 1618 Hardmeyer broadside through the Volk and van der Heyden editions. The Volk second edition seen here on the right of the Hardmeyer is the most extensive. Whether entirely factual or not, the assemblage is a trove of information, especially in concert with the pamphlets. Even with 10 people to a house and more in the palaces, one is hard-pressed to account for housing for 1,500 people within this image. Helpfully, Volk's second broadside notes that the image is not showing all the houses, just the most notable ones. Many locations have family names attached, sometimes even professions and implied marital status in the case of the 5 presumed widows who owned their own homes. The main buildings included houses, palaces, and churches. Businesses included the 2 butchers, a bakery, a tailor, 2 mills, 2 inns, quite possibly with one designated for Catholics and one for Reformed Protestants, the only 2 recognized space in Graubünden, a Lusthaus or gazebo that was attached to the palace, and although it lacked a standalone jail, there was a spin house where female inmates worked looms. This building was flanked by houses owned by women who may have sequestered them from the miners and stone craftsmen. A lone set of gallows remains untouched by the disaster just outside the rock slides dotted pathway to the right. The local wine cellars, mainly underground, also survived the destruction, as did 3 adjoining houses by the river for carving the soapstone into the valuable cookware that had brought the town international renown. Many natural elements are highlighted throughout, such as the groves of sweet chestnut trees on the mountain slopes. These are indicated as number 41, not just once, but twice on either side of the mountain's dotted path, showing the coming destruction. Indeed, the English pamphlets would excitedly lament the loss of the chestnut trees by fire. The vineyards are shown in the mid-range hills with distinctively etched squiggles indicating the vines, a style separately adopted by all 3 publishers, as well as the same print medium. There were numerous decorative gardens as well. A 1618 French pamphlet from Lyon mentions an orangery enclosed in silver vases near the fountain in the square by the main palace, and later iterations of the broadsides, such as a 1635 version by Matthias Marian and the early 18th century one by Swiss naturalist Johann Jakob Schweitzer, further formalized the designs with prominent geometric shapes and suggest a courtly ambiance to each separate plot. And I think you can get a sense of that at the bottom of each image here. Hardmeyer printed his pamphlet for a local priest, Bartholomew Anhorn, who described the style of the Italianate fruit gardens as not unlike areas in Naples or the Genoa Riviera, while van der Heyden's second broadside refers to the district as being in the flower or bloom of its life before its downfall. As with the overabundance and temptation of the Garden of Eden, a climactic theft seems to have coincided with the disaster. One of the survivors, the mute young man from a neighboring town, was up a peach tree picking the fruit after dark. Though peaches were probably not as tightly controlled as wild game, the fact that he was secretly helping himself to the ripe crop of a strange garden in this vibrant and fecund valley implies that he was acting illicitly. Climbing back down at this moment of impact, he was tossed in the air and his shoes were blown off his feet during flight. creating this fall of man, creating partial nakedness rather than revealing it. There would be many other comparisons with Plurs and biblical landscapes, but very few drew on recent events. Although the casualties would turn out to be similar to the circa 1500 deaths at Plurs, and Pliny's accounts were already known, the popular rediscovery of Pompeii was still to come in the 18th century. The much less devastating 1631 eruption of Mount Vesuvius would later spark a number of its own broadsides and comparisons to the recent memory of Plurs, but none with flaps. Likewise, the collapse of another overmined mountain, the Monksborg overlooking Salzburg, would be a comparable, albeit more minor event with some 230 victims in 1669. So with what disasters could the destruction of Plurs be compared when it happened in so much more of a historical vacuum? One French pamphlet alluded to current events such as the fire that had burned the palace on the Paris Ile de la Cité earlier that year, but allowed that this is but little in respect of the Plurs incident. Even more remotely, printer's widow Sarah Mang's German pamphlet on Plurs from 1618, which you see here, cites Hartmann Schädel's 1493 Nuremberg Chronicle for a brief discussion of a Burgundian mountain that was rent asunder in the 13th century, supposedly killing thousands. The repeated image of comets and meteorological wonders marking portents measure at a quarter its size throughout the volume, suggesting that this woodblock of the rockslide represented a unique subject and may only have been used once within the chronicle. It shows some 15 men and women crushed together between two collapsing mountains, their bent peaks already almost touching. Only heads and shoulders are visible, clad in a medley of pointed headdresses, turbans, and helmets. While most accept their fate, one naked male figure tears his hair on the right. The chronicle claims 5,000 casualties before the destruction miraculously ceased. Indeed, as with Plurs, where the unthinkable happened, and an entire town of 1,500 souls vanished in the blink of an eye, the only way to understand the meaning of the damage was through religion. The pamphlets about the Plurs disaster often went into specifics of the inhabitants' wealth and confessional leanings. The untraced 1618 pamphlet from Milan that Sarah Mang reprinted, somewhat neutrally, stated that there were only 3 or 4 houses that were not Catholic. But an English translation of the same pamphlet tweaks the reference and instead notes that it was wholly popish, but then backtracks, specifying that the kirks, well recommended for their building, rich ornaments, and treasure, seemed sufficiently to witness the purity of that people. The Prague pamphlet lists residents of its own who perished in Plurs that night, which, and I quote, was so desperately destroyed that it could hardly have been more terrible at Sodom and Gomorrah, unquote. It also blamed the general relaxation on the feast day of St. Bartholomew, a Catholic holiday, for the lack of concern at signs of troubles in the nearby hills. While Hardmeyer's 1618 broadside text makes no explicit comparison with biblical landscapes, a pamphlet he published in Protestant Zurich the same year was authored by the seeming witness and local Swiss Protestant priest Bartholomew Anhorn, and it includes the greatest detail about Plurs' economic value per capita and the earliest printed objections to the town's sins. It does this by quoting Luke 13, a parable about the death of 18 people in Jerusalem when a tower collapsed. Sidestepping the idea of whether those victims deserved their fate, Jesus points out this was meant to be a lesson to all believers. While the circa 1,500 dead in Plurs greatly increased the impact of the lesson, the pamphlet went on also to quote Isaiah 23, this time making a comparison with the trade empire of Tyre, which the God of the Old Testament was determined to eliminate. Not sure if they were trading in soapstone the way Plurs was. But Hardmeyer's broadside did not include everything. An additional anecdote mentioned in the second Volk edition seems to have originated in the 1619 news report from the Frankfurt Fair, the Relationes Historicae Simulastris Continuatio. This publication was itself aware of the Hardmeyer print, copying the before and after image and 2 static panels, with the before image at the top, including the 93 location numbers. All these figures were, however, removed from the lower half. Let's see a little more detail here. The added text that Wolf reprinted claims that among the few items salvaged from the destruction, a carved stone was found with Hebrew letters spelling out a warning. An expert, named as Doctor of Theology Huber, who came from Catholic Lucerne, provided a translation into German, which is as follows in English. So speaks the Lord. Is my word not like a pickaxe that smites the mountain rock? Fly away from Babylon. Let each man save his life. Let no one be silent about their sins, lest the punishment of the Lord return and reward your wickedness. It draws on several Bible verses, especially Isaiah, which indeed describes God's vengeance as a hammer. The unusual use of the more specific word pico or pickaxe instead may be a conscious choice, perhaps intending to reflect the fact that mining had previously supported the lavish lifestyle of the district's inhabitants. Many of the pamphlets discuss the impact of the rockslide as the thrust of an arrow, a bolt, or even the hammer or pickaxe. The dual illustration for the Relationis reifies this momentum in inscribing two literal arrow signs in the image pointing upward on the face of the mountain at the location that was to blame for the explosion. The letterpress text calls out these symbols explicitly and reproduces the arrow sign. The appearance of the curious inscription and its belated publication presents another seeming confirmation of the cursedness of the site of Plurs. Indeed, several contemporary writers urged that the land never be built on again for fear of renewed divine retribution. The lake eventually receded, but no new settlement has really moved in, though the site has hosted archaeological digs since at least the 1960s and now has a small museum on the topic nearby. Errant church bells and a 12th century soapstone font have reappeared over the years in neighboring churches as well. In another potentially symbolic gesture, the set of gallows on the far right remains unnumbered in most editions of the print, its occupants still swinging as a reminder to other sinners. Its remote location on the outskirts of the town implies a shared justice system with neighboring Prosto. But in no version does the rockside flap cover up the gallows, suggesting that it might represent a more pointed moral conceit. It was omitted from the single surviving painting of pre-disaster Plurs, even though the remote area where it should be, between two tributaries and bridges just beside the main road, is populated only with trees and shrubs. This artwork was housed in the Verduma family summer palace, just far enough away in Prosto to escape the damage. But the gallows was a common sight in early modern landscape prints, as early as the 1493 Nuremberg Chronicle with its triple gibbet in front of Nuremberg. And here you can see Sebastian Munster's cosmography, first printed in 1544, here with Chur, the main city of the same Graubünden canton as Plurs. The gallows placement along an exterior road suggests a possible connection to the apprehension and execution of highwaymen and brigands intent on entering the affluent district. But perhaps the sordid aftertaste of justice is now reflected in the entire region of Plurs itself. Zimmermann's Augsburg pamphlet etching for Sarah Mom even increases the total to 2 swaying bodies. Let's return one last time to the users. Ephemeral publications documented ephemeral events that could eventually be forgotten, however horrific, as new horrors like the 30 Years' War supplanted them. But perhaps the pictures and even the flaps also helped the sheets survive these trying times. Imprints with illustrations, particularly with intaglio editions, which required a secondary cylindrical press, may not have been in a popular price bracket after all. Labor was less expensive than materials, but the additional step to print, cut out, and add the flaps from another matrix increased the publication's overall complexity. The fact that I've shown most impressions from the 17th century collections of the eponymous founder of the Herzog August Bibliothek, the princely founders of the Kunstsammlung Waldburg-Wolfegg, and from the Bavarian electoral core of the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek's collections does suggest their ongoing value to the elite, who also had the best ability to preserve the prints. While the Herzog August Bibliothek sheets are now foldered, a variety of disaster prints once appeared in a single manuscript owned by Duke August and was likely assembled for him by Augsburg merchant and diplomat Philipp Heinhofer. In contrast, most of the Wolfegg sheets are still preserved in their original albums. The Volk we've seen throughout is in album 250 entitled Flugblätter, or Fugitive Sheets, as number 67. Meanwhile, in album 88, labeled Landkarten und Stadtansichten, sort of maps and city views. Plate 214 is an impression from the 1619 Relationes, but the upper half has been cut away and attached earlier as plate 212, leaving only the disaster half on this page, with Matthias Marien's 1635 view of the pre-disaster space pasted in as 213. While the Newberry impression has no identifying provenance, it too bears a number, 480, that suggests it was part of a large album of similar views or historical events. Although they both appeared in 1618, the Hardmeyer broadside and pamphlet were probably not issued together. Their relative scale, the broadside's height of 50.8 centimeters and the pamphlet's mere 21, suggests they could not have been easily bound in a single book, but rather offered separately. Yet, the fact that the princes of Wolfegg required more than one view of the event speaks volumes. Collections of 17th century disaster flaps did not stop there, however. Like the 1618 Plurs disaster, news traveled quickly when the 30 Years' War caught up with the ill-fated German city of Magdeburg, with a 2-month siege starting on May 10th of 1631. No act of God, the devastation here was man-made by the Count Tilly, acting on behalf of the Catholic League and the Holy Roman Emperor, who demanded long overdue tribute. Magdeburg had allied itself with the King of Sweden, but reinforcement troops did not arrive. Tilly's forces broached its city walls with cannons, and by the end of the ensuing sack 3 days later, most of the buildings had burned, and all but 5,000 of its 25,000 inhabitants were dead. These two broadsides of the sack with flap attachments from the orbit of Jacob van der Heyden survive in some 7 variations and 19 impressions. He only signed the second one, however. Impressions of both versions offer a wide margin of blank space around the flap, signaling its presence amid the tumult of the battle ringing the city walls. In the signed print, the flap covers just the old section of the town to the east. While the Wolfenbüttel impression I just showed was missing its flap, the unsigned example expands the flap to the west and uses the wider blank area to explain the flap's presence as a depiction of the post-sack city. As the area covered is well within the etching, neither broadside could seamlessly install the flap via tabs, but piece it directly to the image. The underlying layer depicts the attack in progress rather than an idyllic pre-sack view. Rather than revisiting Magdeburg's idealized past, the emphasis is on the dramatic moment at hand. The version van der Heyden signs bears a shorter letterpress text with a history of the events leading up to the siege and its bloody aftermath. The legend appears in the etching at top left, lettered A to D, where A denotes the 4 points where the walls were broached by the enemy. Further lines add to the legend in 2 later states identify the flap as E, showing a city after its storming. Like the Plurs broadsheets, the letterpress below both prints estimates the number of buildings left standing, about 200 of 1900 after the fire, and the means and numbers of survivors. These were mostly women and girls who had fled into the main church, the others who hid underground in cellars, suffocated and burned. Magdeburg herself quickly perished and became a ruin. All that one can see inside the walls, over and under the flap, is buildings in flame. To conclude, flat print landscapes were relatively uncommon in the 17th century, so the grouping of broadsheets by Hardmeyer, van der Heyden, and Volk forms an unusual corpus in response to the landscape of devastation. Besides van der Heyden's subsequent Magdeburg publications, none of them produced anything of this interactive ilk again. From the proliferation of impressions, it seems likely that they would have had no difficulty selling their existing stock. The survival of at least 35 total impressions of these flat prints and the influence on subsequent prints into the 18th century may point to a relatively high rate of production in a genre in which sheets rarely survive in bulk. None of the Plurs or Magdeburg flat prints included a song to elevate the pathos of the text. They simply didn't need to engage any more of the viewer's senses. While news in all formats served as a reminder of those less fortunate, the addition of the flap brought the viewer literally and figuratively closer to the incident and would have offered an irresistible frisson of schadenfreude, as therefore but the grace of God and a well-timed show of humility went they. Centuries before the proverbial train or car wreck from which the witness cannot look away, these interactive broadsides provided self-paced and safely removed drama with a "you were there" front row seat to the spectacle of mighty and unexpected destruction. While most are in black and white, and this photo is no exception, the one Hardmeyer impression with a hand-colored flap would have overwhelmed users with the changing color of the decimated landscape, just as the stench that arose from the sunken pit that covered the area and sickened and killed some of the first responders attempting to search for bodies. A lingering result, much like that of the World Trade Center attacks. The impressions, now lacking flaps, further reinforce the print's inherent need to move and reconfirm that users couldn't keep their hands off them. Thank you.
Wow, Suzanne, that was really wonderful, and such a detailed and focused overview of all of these sort of seeds and flaps of disaster. I don't think I should talk too much. I see we already have one question in the chat from Allison Stewart, but I'd like to let everyone know that when you have questions, please start thinking. I see Claudia's raised her hand. So Trevor Brandt also, great. You can either write them in the chat, and I'll invite you to unmute yourself and read your question out loud, or raise your hand, and I'll try to keep track of the queue and what order we're going in at the same time.
Okay,
So,
why don't I start with Allison? You can see that one.
sounds
Yeah,
good.
but if I understand your question, yes, I believe there were separately printed components that were pasted together for quite a few of these for the Hardmeyer especially. I think the etching was done separately than the letterpress.
That's what I would have thought as well. But
Yeah.
In the particular image that you were discussing, and it was soon after you talk about 3 broadsides were soon published, blah, blah, blah. I thought you said roller press, that the etching and the letterpress were done together, which didn't make any sense to me whatsoever.
No, they weren't. Like, I mean, you could do it in 2 passes, but then you'd have to cart it over to the paper over to a different shop, probably.
Right.
You wouldn't necessarily have the 2 types of printing presses in the same building.
Right.
But you could also have a very small cylindrical press. That's also possible.
Well, I've been thinking about the difference between intaglio and relief, and it's very possible that in the same shop there were both printing presses, both types of printing presses. But you're absolutely right. The idea of having to go from one press to another
You have to wait for it to dry. You have to make sure you get the right page. There's a lot.
Absolutely. So it doesn't make any sense. Anyway,
Yeah.
thank you.
I think some of the 3 ones that didn't have flaps may have been done that way. On the same sheet, but I think once you add the flap, that's just an extra level of complexity. So you might as well sort of glue it together.
Exactly. Okay, thank you.
Great. And then I think next is Claudia Swan. Hi, Claudia. If you'd like to unmute and ask your question.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. I want to explain that I wasn't on the camera. This is totally for Suzanne's benefit, but I wasn't on camera in the beginning because the post lady came and brought me a package of really cheap prints that I bought.
Ooh,
but I just thought you would appreciate the label.
great. That is a worthy distraction.
Okay, and I had to open it up. Anyway, here's my question. So this is just terrific, as expected, as anticipated. And I love that you're working on what I'm calling in my notes, disaster armchair tourism and personal spectacle. And towards the end of your talk, you moved towards this, but I wondered, and I know that you're brilliant on the materiality of these prints and on the interaction with them, but I want to ask about a slightly different feature of them, which is the actual layout of the landscape. That is to say, the form of landscape projection. That might be too technical a term, but I wondered if towards the end you were going to talk about siege, depictions of sieges, and theaters of war and prints of that sort, of which I don't know if there are any flap sheets, so it's not under the umbrella of this talk. But I just wondered if you could talk about, there was a consistency, especially when you were summing up and you showed, the overview. There's a real consistency here to the perspective on the landscape. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that, which is very different from the lithic landscapes you started with.
That's right, and that's certainly much further back. I mean, that's why I like the idea of it, of you sort of coming in at it as as an unstoppable force when you're trying to move the flaps around, because it's really from so much higher up. It's not as intimate in some ways, but then you get right into the details of it and you realize what's lost, and it's horrifying. But no, it's an interesting mix of, zooming in, as it were, in the original sense. Yeah, no, there definitely were a number of books that showed fortifications in this sort of way. I think there's probably some flaps from an architectural standpoint that relate to that. I didn't want to bring too much of that in. I think there's a surlio that may have something like this. I don't think it doesn't have exactly the same perspective, though. The theater of war is a great idea. This is relating to an article in an anthology on unruly landscape, and there's only so many different threads one can bring into it. So I probably am not going to expand in that direction. But
if I may, since you quoted, sorry, if I may, just for everybody's benefit, since you cited Peter Parshall and his work on Imago Contrafactum, he has a new essay on Jacques Callot, and
that's a good one.
Which is in Dumbarton Oaks volume. I'll post the citation in the chat.
And I haven't seen that one. Thank you, Claudia. Yeah. So no, I definitely could think more about the relationship between perspective and these different types of flap prints. No, thank you.
And I think next in line is Trevor, if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Suzanne. And special thanks to the organizers and sponsors for this. I'm joining from Chicago and wouldn't usually be able to travel, of course, to Wisconsin. So I really enjoyed this and appreciated it. Suzanne, my question is, and I think Tamara in the chat just anticipated my question a little bit, but that's this really interesting juxtaposition between this genre and the Wunderzeichen broadsides, especially how those are much more common, less expensive objects that the viewer was merely one of many depicted witnesses of this event, whereas in the editions that you presented us, the viewer is not only a witness, but is also somebody who's complicit in it. So I'm wondering whether their status as an elite, so juxtaposing that as a more commonplace broadside versus this elite sort of flap, whether that sort of eliteness is an element of the moralizing of these images, or whether they're moralizing at all or speaking directly to the viewer. I know you spoke a little bit about what the text is saying and the degree to which those are actually addressing the viewer, but I'm wondering whether that actually changes throughout the editions, or if it doesn't really address the viewer at all.
Yeah, no, I'm trying to grapple with the question of confessional relevance, because from the way that there are a few snide remarks about the whole area being Catholic, you'd think there wasn't much of a back and forth, but I've been doing a little more reading about Protestant efforts in the area, and it seems like it actually was a bit more of a mix. And in fact, apparently the wealthy in town may actually have been the ones that were the Protestants. So that would presumably add a good bit to the classist issues, the divide of who would even, and that might reflect the type of recipient of this too. I mean, I guess because a lot of the early pamphlets that aren't illustrated and are really quick, I do feel like those are a little closer to the Wunderzeichen ones. That I think those, it's a page or two. I think those might have been more accessible. But when you start getting multiple presses involved and all this detail, I think it may in fact move out of that price range a little bit. Yeah, and Andrew Pettigrew has been did a anthology recently on broadsides, and I think his essay was the problem of broadsides, and just trying to pinpoint what would move it into another category is very interesting. I mean, of course, most prints in this era do survive in elite collections because no one else could afford to have an album, that big for that long. So, how do you adjust for survival in that way too? So really all we know is that as that, you know, all these princes, you know, enjoyed looking at disasters they weren't part of. No, I mean, maybe I think that is a good opportunity for them to, for everyone to reflect on their own blessings, but yeah, it's a little. I do think it. I think sort of the wow factor of the mountain coming out of nowhere has a lot to do with that earlier tradition. You know, does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, class and confessional relevance was a much better way of summarizing what I was asking. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah. There's a lot going on in these.
Mhm.
Okay, next up, Yvonne, if you would like to ask your question. And I think it's helpful. Some people have difficulty reading the chat. If we could just read that question out loud so that for those of us who have difficulty reading can hear the question out loud.
Hi, Suzanne. Thanks so much for your talk. It's great to hear you live instead of just reading you. We've never met. But there's something sort of funny about this genre because I assume that there was no existing plate representing the town when this thing was made.
Right. How did they come up with this level of detail?
Yeah, so the artist is already doing a very imaginative reconstruction from memory. And so I just was wondering about kind of the ground and the flap. And I wrote in the chat whether you've run into a kind of flipped version of this, where the state of disaster is considered the current eyewitness state and becomes, you know, the main image, of which then the flap projects either a future rebuilding or a reminiscent of a lost past. Because the flap is like the contingent element, the thing that could happen. So I'm just wondering about the temporality that's implied by it, and whether you've found other versions of this.
Yeah, the article by Bronwyn Wilson that's kind of come out of it a little bit about the book I showed at the beginning has a lot of good things to say about this sort of turning back time and playing with the temporalities. And I think there's a lot of that in these prints as well. I did find it hard to understand why you would have. I mean, if you really wanted, I mean, wouldn't it be more shocking if the avalanche were underneath, but then again, it's coming down from above. So you can't really have the avalanche be under the previous state, I guess. So I think I feel like they wanted to have the shape of the rock slide be what's falling.
Yeah, it makes sense for the event and for, you know, as you put it, the kind of your participation in the reenactment of.
But you already know that it's fallen by the time you look at it. So it's like there is something lost in the immediacy in a way. But yeah, but I guess just, you know, here you are, if you're not careful, it's a lot of it too. I'm trying to think of, I mean, the fact that the Magdeburg ones, it's just battle and more battle. It's not, that's almost like they're resigned to, you know, the city just being gone. Although I think it does kind of come back a bit in the 18th century, but it's really, I mean, it goes from, you know, broached walls to pure flame, which is really, really pretty frightening in itself. So that's a little bit of a different thing. I'm trying to think of other examples. I mean, the Memento Mori that I showed at the beginning is probably more what one would expect, where it's sort of the assumed reality, but then the real reality is underneath with the skeletal legs. So I guess it's a question of whether it's time or imagination of your moralistic well-being that's being shown. Yeah. So, well, I'll think about that some more. Thank you.
Great. So I know Trevor's question covered some of Tamara's question, but I noticed, Tam, there was another component about cartography to your question. Did you want to sort of speak more about that?
No, I was actually more interested in the Wunderzeichen aspect of it, which I thought you did a nice job answering. So thanks, Suzanne.
No, there were actually quite a lot of things closer to that in the album in Wolfenbüttel, Duke August's collection from Philip Heinhofer. I think there's a very, very large celestial fish of some sort in there, and a pretty rough image. So it was interesting to see the variety. And then there's also, I think in the same book, then you also get the Vesuvius explosion. And I couldn't get into it in this talk, but quite a few of the same artists are jumping on each event, and they are all doing disaster after disaster. A lot of that is, of course, you get a strong reaction, you make sales. It's really something people respond to. But the idea of having, an entire album of disaster prints is really interesting. I guess the one in Wolfegg, which the curator there was kind enough to tell me what was on, the 2 previous pages before the bottom half of the disaster that I took a picture of the last time I was there. The fact that you would reorder what's happening in the disaster. In that case, both of the before images, the top half, those were first in the album. So I guess they wanted to make it really clear there was a division between Plurs as the independent, financially sound area, and then what happens after. So that's I found that really interesting as well. But the fact that they stuck a different print in the middle of it is also of the same scene. There wasn't a loyalty to keeping the 2 halves together over the page. It was, no, I think I like this one here in the middle somehow. So yeah, I found that fascinating.
I like these disaster print specialists. It's pretty amazing, although not so foreign to our present, I would suppose. The next question is from Matt Mateus, and would you like to say that out loud for everybody, please? Thank you.
Sure. I realized I wanted to preface this question that I'm thinking about identity and what does the print do to the identity of those who perished in the disasters with regard to their local communities, fellow co-religionists, and so on. So my question is basically, these disaster flap prints seem to entail layers of viewing modes, which is really interesting to me, as you pointed out. I'm wondering about the legends and numbers, which seem to partly correspond with an archival mode associated with I'm thinking here of foreign countries, foreign cities, and ruins as part of kind of like virtual tourism. Mm-hmm. And so to what degree does this make such sites foreign, and in particular foreign in one's own homeland, or perhaps sending these sites back in time?
Yeah, it's a ruin that doesn't exist anymore. I mean, they tried digging bodies out. They tried digging their possessions out. I think there was a very little that was actually recouped at the time, and there's been occasional attempts to do archaeology, but I don't think there's been a whole lot done with the site. But I really like the idea of this, of it as again the tourism element. This is like a tour, the tour of Rome, but very, very specifically being called out in the numbers. I mean, it's also odd which sites are numbered. I didn't have time to mention it, but the Jacob van der Heyden print that didn't have a flap was the only one that gave a number to the gallows. It was number 35. It was the last one in the list, and all the other ones don't number it, sort of ignore it in this weird way. And I think I need to learn more about, if anybody here knows about what having the gallows says about your city, if there's some sort of level of jurisprudence that you have to attain to have one. I'd be interested in that. But I think there may have been an imperial connection with the Nuremberg one. But yeah, no, just the fact that there's this reconstruction of this list of people and locations, and all the houses look a little bit alike. They don't really look like other surviving sketches. There's a couple that relate to the Summer Palace, which you apparently can still go visit. I actually want to go and look at it in person now, because it boggles my mind that that's the only thing really that's left. You can even have parties in it if anybody's looking for a venue, but little dire. But yeah, it just the specificity is really crazy, and it makes you want to learn more about the people, because, some, as I said, some of them are mentioned by their profession. Some of, you can sort of, see that there are women over by the spin house, which, keeping them in line, I guess, and so forth. So there's a lot there, but it's just so slippery in terms of accuracy because there's no sense of where exactly he got this information. So, yeah. And then of course, print makes everything go viral pretty quickly in this case. So I'd really like to see that supposed sort of warning, the Hebrew letters that were supposedly found. I kind of wonder if that happened at all. It seems like that sort of came up in the second round of the prints. I sort of feel like that may have been entirely created for effect, but you never know. Yeah.
There a little bit of a logistics question since it's come up a couple of times in the chat. Well, I encourage everyone to sort of think up other further questions you might have for Suzanne in the meantime. Jennifer, do you know about the recording and how people can learn about
So
that?
the lecture is being recorded. If you are interested in the recording, send me an email because I need to. Is Tanya on this call? No. It will.
I'm here.
Oh, you're here, Tanya. Where do we post the lectures? Is it on YouTube or?
It's on our YouTube account. Yes.
Okay. Do you have a link to that you could put in the chat?
Yeah. Give me a minute.
Okay. So we'll put the link in. It'll take us probably tomorrow. We can post the lecture on this link that.
That's great. Okay, and I'm looking at the comments here, and so we know a Bartholomew Einhorn relation. That's fantastic. I don't know enough about him, but the fact that he sort of took a hard left and right, I guess, and started talking trash a little bit about the Catholics was really fascinating in light of everything else happening and everything the district had already gone through. So that was the sort of fascinating figure, and most of the pamphlets that were put out about this, if there is a name, it was a preacher, and I think adding that probably adds another layer of supposed learnedness, supposed authority to it. If you say that they're the pastor of such and such an area, but I believe Einhorn was actually from Mayenfeld, which was really quite close to the Plurs area, and he probably would have at least been able to see what had happened maybe a few days later. Yeah.
So I just wanted to note, Tanya has posted a link. Tanya Kolarek, if you look in your chat, she's posted a link to the YouTube channel that this will appear. It might go up tomorrow. It has to buffer and do all those things.
Yeah, so subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Yes,
if you want
please.
to, get a hold of this lecture. Do it now before you forget. I have so many questions. I think I'll try to ask one of them since there doesn't seem to be anything else in the queue, but thank you again for this wonderful talk. Just as a note, I really enjoy the idea of the song about the disaster, and that being another kind of interactivity a user of these broadsides could have had, in addition to the sort of visible interactive modality. Singing a song while looking at the sort of sequence of buildings and so on and so forth would be a pretty amazing viewing or multimedia experience. I'm going to go back to the sort of main question and comparison you set up at the beginning with the Legozzi, right? So these kinds of objects as something that are parallel to a pilgrimage device. The fact that the Vesuvius event doesn't actually have a flap, right, or broadsides with a flap. Is there something to it that it's harder to moralize about because there's no sense that, oh, this was a wealthy town, they had it coming, or they were so popish, they had it coming. Is there something to that, do you think? And then one place where you could maybe investigate further to think more about that, I wonder if you have anything to say about the texts that are not broadsides, right? The relation and so on and so forth. Do those sort of more, I'm assuming, narrative accounts, do those have sort of rhetorical resemblances to sort of virtual pilgrimage texts and so on? I
Interesting.
don't know if you could riff on any aspect of that
Okay.
question, but it's just so.
Let's
cool.
see. So well, I think the main point of the relation was to tell everyone who used to do business with Plurs at Frankfurt that they're not gonna. Basically, I think I'm not quite sure if this was I think this may have been an extended version. There may have been a very brief mention of the disaster, but I haven't been able to find the source to that. But it reprints the whole list of the names from the broadside, and then does their own print without the flap. But which is actually also quite large. It folds out from the book. So they did put a lot of effort into that. Yeah, I think pretty much most of the pamphlets have some kind of biblical response. I mean, I think it sort of starts with, oh, look on how lucky you are, and continue to do well because this could be you, no, but not specifically because they were so bad, just because you never know when something's coming. It sort of starts with a light morality glaze, and then it starts working into more, oh, but maybe they were too wealthy, maybe their churches were too ornate, they're too popish. It sort of builds, it seems to me, even though it's not really explicit. And I mean, and the fact that, but I do find the difference, the wealth inequality is a really troubling separate element as well. I don't think that's necessarily coming out in the flat prints, but if anything, I think a lot of the publications are coming from places that are predominantly Protestant, so that they're not, they're looking at they're looking at the Catholics mainly. Let's see, as to the pilgrimage, as I said, I really did like that, the ruins tour idea carrying through into the imagined underlayer of this rock slide, just the idea that you just can't see it anymore. It's just gone. And then until it's not, because of the flap, it sort of, I mean, it makes it, I mean, it's just like, what is this, Atlantis? This is something that no one expects to see again, and yet there it is. So it does have some similarity to the Francis of Assisi idea, where you were going back in time, you were retracing the steps, you were seeing how it would feel to be there in the cave, meditating on that skull. Yeah, it's I don't know. There's a lot to it. I don't know if that helps, but
No, it's great. I just wanted to hear you riff some more. So that was, yeah, it's wonderful.
Ooh, I think I see
We have a
something about
couple
gallows
more
in the chat. Let me see.
questions.
Wait, hold on.
So does Marnie Blair, would you like to read your question out loud?
I guess I can. I'm the one related to Bartholomew Anhorn. In fact, my middle name is Bartholomew.
Wow.
So, and my last name is Anhorn. So he's like my first ancestor, I'm told. But my question was just, have you ever noticed apotropaic symbols incorporated into like disaster prints, like ones that would either be superstitious or provide warning against sort of disasters or warding off disasters?
Well, I kind of wonder about those arrows, those that are both in the text of the relation. Oh, I don't know if you saw that. There was, yeah, sorry. There's sort of a close up of the hill that has fallen down on top of this town, and two sort of straight up arrows with a sort of a cross underneath it show where that's happening, or where that had happened from, and it sort of gets pulled out into the text as well, in the relation talking about the story of this happening. I mean, that in terms of symbols, that might be the closest. There was also the story that showed up relatively late in the process of publishing all of these histories of the disaster, that said that there was a piece of stone that had Hebrew verses in it, warning that this was just a bad location, and everyone needed to repent and get out of Babylon. a lot of mining, with a lot of mining type references, which made it seem very specific to this mining town. I think even just having the print might be considered itself a deterrent. The idea that you're considering, it's a memento mori. You're considering, all the ways, you could die poorly, how you could not be grateful, not be ready. So I think even just meditating on the fact that you can be gone in the blink of an eye has a lot to do with that. But you have to, you really have to be into it, though. I think you have to, immerse yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, they kind of look like hail crosses, or like what you're talking about is also kind of like the ex voto, like thankfulness for living through the disaster in a way. I guess. I don't know if there's flap anatomy about those, but thank you. It's funny. It just, my mind's sort of blown right now, and I'm rambling because my dad was an avalanche technician, and he's from Switzerland. So.
That's incredible. Wow.
Yeah, it's totally weird.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay, we have a couple more questions and we've got to wrap up at
not a
6:30. So let's see here. The next one, Tom Dale, are you ready to ask your question?
Well, I think you've in some ways you've answered it. I was just thinking about the gallows motif and how it might relate to the pictures that Mitchell Marbach discusses in his book on the cross, the wheel, and this idea of a spectacle of public punishment. And I'm wondering whether that relates then to your ideas of how this print is used in some ways as a mourning, and the sort of moralizing message that is behind some of it.
Yeah, no, I clearly need to look at that. Thank you for that reference. Yeah, I think the fact that it sort of fades in and out in the different depictions of the area is what's sort of fascinating, because it's presented as sort of factual in some cases and then isn't in the painting. So maybe it was but it could have been a temporary structure too. It doesn't have to necessarily have been a permanent installation. So the idea that the rich Protestants who have their painting of the area that they're lording it over, I mean, their main palace is in the middle of town. The summer palace is actually still pretty big, but they have that painting in there, and they didn't want the gallows in there. So that sort of raises some more questions. But yeah, I do think that would fit into what I was trying to get at in terms of having the gallows not disappear. I mean, maybe if the gallows did get covered in the landslide, that would mean that they had suffered enough. I don't know, that this had wiped everything clean, but that wasn't the sense I was getting. No. All right, I see it.
Tony, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this. I'm learning so much, and I'm wondering, just by looking at the print itself, the way it uses shadow, it's almost counterintuitive in the sense that you cannot really tell which part is protruding, which part is going in, almost creating this tidal effect that makes you want to animate the geographical surface. And I'm thinking about Kircher's Mundus Subterraneus and how the darker you go, it's the inner you go into earth. I mean, that's much later, but I'm thinking maybe there's a way that just, the contrast between light and shadow creates a visuality about the instability of earth. And I'm wondering if you have more thoughts or, contextual knowledge about it.
Yeah, I really wish I had a color image of that, the last impression I showed with the hand coloring on the flap, because it seemed like whoever colored it really wanted to emphasize like the contrast there. Yeah, I mean, there's not, you're right, it is a little confusing in terms of shading. The Augsburg pamphlet that sort of drops the whole rock pile on top of the area almost does the best in terms of using plate tone to recognize just the mess that this is.
a lot of the other ones seem to be pretty cleanly wiped. So they're not being painterly about it. They're just turning out as many as possible to meet demand. And as I was trying to show with the sort of squiggles in the vineyards, I mean, I think it's relatively lightly drawn as well. It's not, it wasn't done with a huge amount of care for each of the three main printers. Yeah, no, I love the idea of the the light and shadow you're talking about. I don't think that was necessarily in the minds of the publishers here or the artists, except for maybe Zimmerman in Augsburg, which is sort of a favorite of mine in other ways, even though it doesn't have moving parts. But yeah, no, I think it's in the text almost that you get more of a discussion about sort of the internalness. I mean, when you have people who survive because they go down underground, they go in the wine cellar to get more wine, and they just happen to make it at the right time. Or I don't think anyone actually died inside the mine because it was at night, but there's certainly that sense of going into the dark is certainly dangerous, more so than they thought. So I don't know. I could definitely think more about sort of the mining aspect of it, and it'd be nice if more of that depth had come into the image. But yeah, I don't think. Yeah, and I'm sorry I didn't have a video of the flap in movement for that one. I could only buy one of these prints that didn't have the flap, so it was a little hard to recreate it. I do like showing things as they're being handled, of course, and it's been a long time since I've seen any of the ones in Europe in person. But yeah, I mean, maybe you'd get a better sense if you had the shadow of the flap descending with it. That's something I haven't really talked about. So maybe I need to think about where the shadow goes for these. Thank you.
I love that idea. We have 1 minute left, and I just want to acknowledge there's so many great comments, questions, links in the chat. Enjoy it. It's amazing. Claudia Swan, June Nakamura, both just sort of spewing out the references. Really grateful to that. James Clifton has a question. Jim, do you want to quickly ask it, and then we can all, sort of take off?
I'll quickly ask it. I have a particular interest in Vesuvius, which you mentioned, and I just wondered if the kind of the dissemination of your disaster, the references, you said there were some references from Vesuvius looking back to your disaster. Were those in Italian sources, or were they all in German sources?
The ones I know, I think, were in German sources. Yeah.
Okay. You might be able to see, I've got San Gennaro sort of overseeing all of my activities here, so I thought to ask. Thank you.
Yeah, but as I said, we have a lot of the same German artists just hitting up every single disaster in a row.
Well, this was just such a great talk and such a great discussion. Thank you so much for Suzanne. Thank you to everyone who came and asked questions, especially the grad students out there. Shout out to you. Oh, and I didn't acknowledge Katie Reinhardt also contributed to the references in the chat. Thanks everyone for coming. Don't forget to subscribe to our social media. Tell your friends so you can see the recording of this lecture. And I hope you all have a great rest of your evening or whatever time it is in your time zone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Fabulous, Suzanne. Thank you.